This week on the show, we focus on matters of global politics and African relevance. Our guest tonight is Ambassador Reuben Brigety. He shares his views. We get your views on the issues. And as always, we have Africa's top 10. You're watching the Africa Leadership Dialogues. I'm Julie Gichuru. On the show this week, we host a guest with a unique perspective on Africa. Ambassador Reuben Brigety is the Dean of International Affairs at the George Washington University.
Ambassador Reuben Brigety II is the Dean of Elliott School of International Affairs at the George Washington University. He recently served as the appointed representative of the United States of America to the African Union and permanent representative of the United States to the UN Economic Commission for Africa. Prior to this appointment, Ambassador Brigety served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in the Bureau of African Affairs with responsibility for Southern African and regional security affairs. He has an extensive background in foreign policy, humanitarian affairs, and international relations. He has also served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in the Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration. Ambassador Brigety is a distinguished midshipman graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy, where he earned a Bachelor of Science in Political Science, served as a brigade commander, and received the Thomas G. Pownall Scholarship. He also holds a Master of Philosophy and a PhD in International Relations from the University of Cambridge.
Let's get his perspective on global politics and Africa. Reuben, thank you so much for making time to be on the Africa Leadership Dialogues. Now, you've had extensive experience in the US, in Africa, and generally in understanding leadership and the geopolitical situation globally. My first question, what's going on? The world is changing so fast. What is happening?
Well, I will tell you, quite frankly, first of all, Julie, it's great to be here with you here in Nairobi. I've told many of my colleagues, I'm not an old man, but I'm not exactly a young man either. And I suspect that this is arguably one of the most volatile times in foreign affairs since the end of World War II. There clearly was a great deal of euphoria after the end of the Cold War, and people thought that politics were going to be fundamentally reset. And then from the 90s through the early 2000s, the idea of this multipolar world. What I think we're seeing, whether it be with the horrific terrorist attacks in Dhaka, Istanbul, Baghdad, or challenges to the financial order, as we saw with the Greek financial crisis a few years ago, there are governments everywhere are under serious threat. Serious pressure to deliver from their citizens on a wide variety of levels, on services, education, things of that nature. And as governments are under challenge, populations all around the world are looking for alternatives. I think that is regrettably one of the things that is the animating force behind ISIS. In addition to their horrific ideology, when you see young people that are flowing from Europe, from the United States to go fight for ISIS, they clearly are following some sort of disenfranchisement with their modern societies in which they're not feeling comforted. We also see large numbers of populations in the Western world, certainly in my country, in the United States, that feel that the current economic model is not working for them. And while there are a small number of people that are getting very, very rich, large numbers of people are being further and further left behind. And whether it be these sorts of ideological challenges or these economic challenges, there is a real need for governments to find responsible responses to actually help improve the lives of the people if we're going to ensure that our current financial and state models can be viable for the 21st century.
Responsible responses, that's absolutely critical, but what seems to be happening is in so many ways the exact opposite.
Yes.
I look at the 90s, I was a teenager, the world was changing, it was opening up, we saw the Berlin Wall come down, we thought, the end of the Cold War marked a new era, and it did.
Right.
But all of a sudden, two and a half decades later, it looks like the walls are coming back up. So right. Britain has opted to exit from Europe, which seems to be a very puzzling and bizarre decision when you consider the economics of it.
Right.
America looks to be possibly voting in Donald Trump, whose ideology is really seems to be enshrouded with a lot of, in fear and division. So responsible response is not currently happening globally. What does this mean for all of us, and what does it mean for Africa?
Sure. Well, first thing that I would say is, starting from your starting point in the 1990s, from a sense of hope, and then where we are now, the thing that we all have to keep in mind is that history is not inevitable. It is a direct result of the choices that we make, particularly the choices that we make when confronted with serious challenges. So, for example, if one takes the Brexit vote, I see this as a number of different ways. First, it is a sovereign choice by the people of Great Britain. You are correct that while there is an economic argument for many to have decided to leave, that the nature of the trading relationship was not ultimately favorable, it's clear from opinion polling and also from public behavior that the principal reason for Brexit was concern about immigration. And further, one sees in the reaction against Brexit in large portions, of whether it be in Scotland or whether it be in large portions of London, people standing out and reaffirming, not just that they want to be part of Europe, as they say, that's debatable, but reaffirming that the kind of xenophobic incidents that have been happening are not what they want Britain, England to stand for. I think in my own country, frankly, the United States this November, our people will make a sovereign decision about who they want to be as president, and there are legitimate issues on the table. But with the kinds of, frankly, very divisive language that's come from one particular candidate in that environment, there are large numbers of people in both parties, both the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, that say this kind of xenophobia, this kind of outright racism has no place in the American electorate. We see large numbers of people from Canada to Austria that are welcoming Syrian refugees in their home. The reason I say all this is that while the bad news is clearly that, as I mentioned, there are enormous challenges to governments, there are nevertheless large numbers of people, ordinary citizens, that are standing up and saying that this is not the world we want, this is not the country that we want. And that is where the fight is. Whether it be in Kenya or in the United States or in Great Britain or in Turkey or elsewhere, it is average citizens working with their government, sometimes working in opposition to their government, but saying that because we know that history is not inevitable, we want to claim a better future for ourselves. And that, I think, is where the actual locus of activity has to be.
So there is some good news.
I think so.
Okay, so let's come to America, U.S.-Africa relations. Yes. And you are spearheading the setting up of an Institute on African Studies at the George Washington University.
That's correct.
Why is this necessary?
Sure. Well, I currently serve as the Dean of the Elliott School of International Affairs at the George Washington University. We are one of the largest schools of foreign affairs in the United States. We have about 2,300 undergraduates, about 800 master's students. We are right in the heart of Washington, D.C., just 2 blocks from the White House, 2 blocks from the State Department. And as a result of that, I believe fundamentally that the study of Africa is vitally important. It's important for its own sake, but it's also important for anybody that wants to be a serious student of international affairs, because virtually every collective problem that the globe faces is at play here in Africa, and usually at play here in Africa at a much greater place than amplitude than it is elsewhere in the world, whether it is the importance of climate change or fighting radical extremism, or the importance of how one does economic development, or just the very questions of democracy and governance themselves. So we want to place in the heart of Washington, D.C., a state-of-the-art, world-class institute that will not only allow non-African students the place to come and begin to learn about Africa, but also a place for African students and scholars to come to us so that we can have African voices in the classroom, so that we can bridge that Atlantic divide and the importance of bringing those two great continents together.
Stay with the Africa Leadership Dialogues.
You worked in Africa for quite a while.
Yes.
What's your candid view on the state of the continent and the quality of African leadership?
Sure. Well, when I served as the U.S. ambassador to the African Union, I would tell colleagues all the time that the narrative of Africa rising is a probable narrative, but is not an inevitable one. It's one that requires the specific choices of governments, of individual leaders, as well as citizens in order to make it happen. The quality of the government they want, the strengthening their institutions, strengthening transparency, and things of that nature. At the Elliott School, one of the things that we say is that we are in the business of building leaders. And leadership is something really quite specific. It's the ability to bring different people together around a common problem set to find common solutions to that problem in a way in which they would not do absent the application of such leadership. So Africa has been blessed with a number of incredibly visionary leaders. So whether one speaks of, obviously, Mandela being the most important, but whether it be Haile Selassie, Kwame Nkrumah, or in more recent days, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, or others. But to be frank, and this is true for my own country, in an environment where institutions are less strong, the quality of individual leadership becomes all the more important. So one of the questions that I have as a scholar and as someone who counts himself as a friend, indeed as a family member of Africa, what more can we do to help incentivize and develop the ability of Africans at all levels, at grassroots village level, but also at national parliamentary levels, and indeed at Pan-African levels as well, to be in the business of building their institutions for the future, thinking more about the collective as opposed to their own individual interests. I would say that this is a problem not only for Africa, it's a problem everywhere, but is again, because the institutions in Africa are weaker, it's all the more important that the quality of leadership in Africa be even stronger. And this is something that we clearly are stand ready to partner with to try to support.
If you were to highlight 3 characteristics that you think a leader, an African leader, or even a leader anywhere in the globe today requires to get through these dynamic times, what would those 3 be?
Sure. I think the first is vision that's rooted in historical perspective. As I said before, many of the freedoms, many of the wonderful things that we enjoy today are a direct result of the deliberate choices that our forefathers and foremothers made in the past. And they made them often under much more difficult circumstances than we live in right now. So one of the things that we try to teach our students is if the people who came before us could have the moral courage to make the choices they did in very difficult circumstances, whether it be the moral courage to join the anti-apartheid movement as an underground fighter, or the moral courage to stand up for civil rights in the United States when things were much more difficult, then surely we can find the moral courage now to fight poverty, to fight corruption, to be bold in talking out against extremism or against xenophobia in our countries. And we have to be able to do that. So that's the first thing. First is vision. The second, as I said, is a sense of moral courage. Winston Churchill once said that courage is the most important of virtues because it's the one that makes all the others possible. This is a line that I tell my children all the time, because almost by definition, when you're faced with a difficult problem, it will be hard by definition. So developing the kind of moral courage that allows one to take on these tough political challenges, I think, is vital at any leader, whether they're a prime minister or whether they're a village chief or a headmistress in a school. And then the final thing I would say is judgment. And this is something which frankly takes time to develop, but understanding how far you can push and when you have to be conciliatory, when you have to stand on principle. I think these 3 things, vision, moral courage, and judgment, are the most important, from my perspective, characteristics of any leader.
Very interesting. If we were to take a step back from the global situation and, look back at the history of it, the modern history, the recent history, America in particular and the civil rights movement, so much achieved. And yet, decades later, one may sit back and think, where did we go wrong? There's still something in the system that's not quite working.
Right.
Where is that disconnect, do you think?
Well, I would say a few things. I mean, first of all, you are correct that we have to take stock of where we are. The fact that, a son of Africa, Barack Hussein Obama, is the president of the United States, is something that would have been unthinkable, certainly when my parents were younger. The fact that we have an environment where there are no legal barriers to how far one can go in the United States, when just 40 or 50 years ago, there are legal barriers to which water fountain you could use. I mean, this is all really quite remarkable. And yet, there are still issues. There are issues with perception. Where virtually every opinion poll, for example, in the United States, say that African Americans have a very different view of the justice system than people that are non-African Americans. There are differences that are empirically linked to life outcomes, whether it be in long-term family wealth or even sort of life expectancy, that are still very closely correlated with race, not only for African Americans but also for Latinos. And one has to ask the question, why is that? And yet. The beauty of America is that one is an American not based on one's ethnicity, not based on one's familial heritage, but based on one's adherence to an idea. The idea that truly all of us are created equal, the idea that we are committed to sovereign democracy. And we have to continue to work in an environment where everybody feels that they have a stake in this country. Not only minorities, but also, frankly, where many people from traditional ethnic majority in the United States feel beleaguered. After all, it's now 2016, and they would argue, we didn't do anything to hold other minorities back. And I think that's, frankly, something that we have to be very honest about, that we have to sort of create a welcoming environment for everybody, where we can have very different political views about, what to do with the size of government, what to do with, how to address healthcare. But ultimately, we all have a place of dignity and worth in this country.
So much to learn from each other as Africa and the US, and I'll come to that in a moment. But first, let's talk about democracy for a moment. Sure. As we look at the current environment, I'm hearing a lot of debate about the merits and demerits of democracy. The fact that you will only be as great as your most enlightened, as your masses. If they are enlightened, then. If they are not enlightened and not progressive, then you're going to suffer. Is this the best model? Could we do better? What do you think? What would you say about democracy in the current environment?
Sure. Well, again, to quote Winston Churchill, that democracy is the worst form of government except for all the others. Right? So even if one has a question of what kind of system of government do we want to govern our country by, presumably one would have to ask the people, and that, by definition, is democracy. So there are, and even the founding fathers of the United States understood this issue of, frankly, sort of mass, the view of sort of mass public opinion, and tempering that with institutions that could channel it in different ways, which is why we have a Senate and a House of Representatives, and the Senate, is meant to be smaller and meant to be more deliberative. It's why ultimately we don't elect our presidents by direct popular votes. Why we have something called the Electoral College, which is meant to sort of be sort of an arbiter between the mass vote and something to help tolerate those passions. However, it is clear, right, that democracy is a messy process. I think particularly in environments where things are, where institutions are weaker. Kenya, as you know far better than I, has had a very regrettable history, particularly in the last decade or so, with regard to electoral violence. That's true not only in Kenya, it's true in many other parts of Africa, where just the mere holding of elections themselves, frankly, can be an arbiter of security. We have regrettably, in our own election cycle, have seen instances of violence at various intervals, which we thought we were beyond. But that shows that this is a process that has to be guarded very, very sacredly. But that's why the integrity of the institution is very important. That's why we have to be able to have options for choice. I think, frankly, what happened in Nigeria last year with their elections and the proof that indeed a leader can be changed peacefully at the ballot box was an extraordinary symbol for all of Africa. And it's one that one hopes that we continue to follow, but it has to be guarded really quite jealously and quite fragilely.
It's an interesting age we live in. What would you say that Africa could learn from America, and what could America learn from Africa?
Well, I think the most important lesson that America can show, not only to Africa, but to the rest of the world, is that it is indeed possible to have a multi-ethnic, multi-confessional country where everybody feels that they have a stake in the citizenry. That, in my view, is our most important lesson. I mean, sure, we're a wealthy country. Sure, we have institutions that are hundreds of years old, but the fact that we have done so And we have worked through our problems, and we continue to work through them towards a better day, I think, is a lesson that particularly as the world becomes more globalized and as migrants move across borders, I think that's one that can be applied here in Kenya and many other countries around the world. I would say that one of the things that the United States can learn from Africa broadly is the importance of community and the importance of individual connections. In our post-industrialized state, we have, I think, largely forgotten that. We are a country that is arguably sort of very wealthy economically, but increasingly poor socially. And we see this in a number of ways where a number of people, a number of my countrymen feel very dislocated from others. It arguably is one of the things that has led to many of the mass shootings we have seen in the United States. Is not simply the availability of weaponry, but the sense of social dislocation that many of these perpetrators have. And our finding a way back to those very close social linkages, I think, is a lesson obviously we can and should take from Africa.
Thank you so much. To close, please look into the camera and deliver your message. What would you say to Africans watching who are wondering, what role can I play in uplifting my continent? What are your words of wisdom?
Well, my brothers and sisters, I would simply say that every individual matters. Every individual life has dignity, and every single one of us can make a difference no matter where we are in society. And the future that we have is not one that is simply given to us. It is the future that we make. And I would encourage you to struggle for a brighter future for Africa.
Stay with the Africa Leadership Dialogues.
My name is Ambassador Reuben Brigety, Dean of the Elliott School of International Affairs, and you're watching the African Leadership Dialogues.
Very interesting insights there from Ambassador Brigety. Let's get to your views on the issues.
This week we asked you, what's your view on the state of Africa and its leadership? Kaivilo Muteti says, Africa hasn't fully embraced its youth who can be resourceful if accorded the right opportunities, especially in leadership positions.
My name is Joseph Njao Njui, and I'm watching Africa Leadership Dialogues from Nairobi. My opinion on African leadership is that it is slightly average, where in some countries we find countries doing better than others, but in others we find that leaders are really dragging the country down, whether in terms of economic challenges or in terms of political challenges. So I would think it would be better for leaders in Africa to come together and in unison agree on a better way to bring or to take our continent forward. And as individual leaders, once your time is up, your time is up. Thank you.
To join our conversation, go to our G+ page, Africa Leadership Dialogues, on Facebook, Africa Leadership Dialogues, on Twitter, @AfricaLD, and on WhatsApp, send your video comments to +254 715 816 033.
And it's time now for Africa's Top 10.
On Africa's Top 10 this week, we feature nations with the best judicial independence. The research focused on the extent in which judiciary is independent from influences of members of parliament, citizens, or big firms. On a scale of 1 to 7, 1 being heavily influenced, 7 being entirely dependent. This is according to the World Economic Forum. Starting us off at number 10 is Lesotho with an index of 4.12 and is ranked 55 globally. Coming in at number 9 is Seychelles. The island nation is ranked 53 globally with an index of 4.15. Positioned at number 8 is Kenya. The East African country attained an index of 4.18 and is ranked 52 globally. Taking the number 7 spot is Cape Verde with an index of 4.2 and is ranked 51 globally. Slotted in at number 6 is Ghana. The West African country located along the Gulf of Guinea and Atlantic Ocean garnered an index of 4.4 and is ranked 48 globally. Namibia takes the number 5 spot with an index of 4.7 and is ranked 39 globally. At number 4 is Botswana. The South African nation is ranked 35 globally with an index of 4.96. Anchored in at number 3 is Rwanda. The land of 1,000 hills attained an index of 4.98 and is ranked 34 globally. Coming in at number 2 is Mauritius. The volcanic island nation in the Indian Ocean is ranked 31 globally with an index of 5.1. At number 1 this week is South Africa. The rainbow nation garnered an index of 5.4 and is ranked 24 globally. And that's Africa's Top 10 this week.
Now for our African proverb as we close the show. No matter how much milk a cow has, you can't milk butter from it. No, you simply can't milk butter from a cow. We cannot assume that history will be made or history will go the way we hope it will go. We must be strategic. The work must be done. Leadership and responsibility. Blessings to you and blessings to Africa.